In a modern art gallery in Scottsdale, Arizona, the work of a major American artist is on display. Little known at the time of his death in 1962, the monumental abstract paintings of Morris Louis are now accepted as modern masterpieces. They affect those who take the time to look. Working in series, he created more than 600 large paintings in less than 8 years.
Goes to show you what people can do with it when they're inspired.
They are called veils, unfurleds, and stripes.
He's awesome. What can you say?
His studio was a converted dining room, 12 feet by 14.
And the colors are so vibrant.
What Louis accomplished there has long been subjected to speculation and misconception.
He could have worked on it for months, putting different colors on top of different colors and to come up with this full body of color. That's the size of the dining room that he made these in. That doesn't even fit in there. This big one right here doesn't even fit in there. So I kind of expect to see footprints.
The negative space with the great color, I mean, it just, to me, knocks you over. Yeah, I think it's great.
I assumed a large studio in San Francisco, in Soho. A huge loft. And that's obviously not the case.
And I'll never look at a Morris Louis painting quite the same way again. I'll always think, well, no. It's like a beautiful symphony. It just kind of flows over you.
And it embraces a sense of purity that I don't think his contemporaries managed to achieve. So it segregates him from the rest. This great distinction of knowing when to stop is just as important as the application itself.
Every spot of paint that's put on the unprimed cotton duck is something in itself, and there's a dialogue between the duck and the paint.
Usually the sum is greater than the parts, but with Louis, each of the parts is also the sum of it, and that's a very remarkable thing.
One thing that's sure is that he's really great, and you really see that in almost whatever you see.
I think Morris's paintings had that immediate sense of something grand and beautiful and striking.
His pictures have a kind of power to them, which is very distinctive.
Louis stands up in the sheer delight it gives our eyes. Louis delights.
Morris Louis Bernstein was born in Baltimore, Maryland on November 28, 1912. He grew up in a family more interested in medicine than art. But in 1927, Morris received a scholarship to the Maryland Institute College of Art to pursue his dream to paint. Fellow student Charles Schucker shared that dream.
I started at the Maryland Institute, and at the Maryland Institute, I met Morris. The Maryland Institute was a wonderful building for a young person to be in that had never been in a place like that, and particularly to work there. Inside the front door, this great staircase that went up to a balcony that ran around the whole thing. It was very grand. We both spent 4 years there. We had an attitude, the two of us, you know, that kids have, that we were going to do it all. And we were interested in paint, but paint in terms of color. We were both affected by the way Matisse used color in relationship to reality. I remember the first things I saw of Morris's, he couldn't draw with a shit. I mean, he really couldn't draw. And that was pure hell in that kind of an art school. But we were both utterly passionate about painting.
Following graduation in 1932, Louis found little support in Baltimore. His need to paint took him to New York, where he found support from the government's WPA project. But he did not find personal success. Frustrated and broke, he returned to his family in Baltimore. There he met a woman who would become his partner for life.
I lived in a duplex, and the other side was Morris's family. And we had gardens at that time in the back of the house. And I met Morris over the tomatoes. He had just come back from New York, from the WPA, not happy, really depressed. And he would come over and we would meet, and the relationship grew. And we married. And we lived in a 2-room apartment in Silver Spring. And he was painting, and I was working. Well, what he got from me, I think, was an acceptance of him. I had never been involved in art. I really knew nothing about the whole world of art. I responded to the person, and I knew that there was integrity there, and there was something very genuine there. And then we are able to buy a little house on Legation Street, and what had been the dining room became the studio.
Marcella and Morris settled into a daily routine.
And in the morning, I would get up and go to school, because I was teaching, and then later principaling, and he would go to work. And when I came home, he would typically be sitting on the front step, and the painting would either be still drying, or it would have been rolled up and taken down to the basement. So often when it was finished, I had not seen a finished painting. He helped me with my monthly reports. I was principal. Arithmetic was never my strong point, so he would do it with me, and very quickly. Everything he did quickly, but the interesting thing was that he had such skill that you never felt he was rushing. But things would get done 10 times sooner than if anybody else did them. If he wrapped a package, the ends of the string came out absolutely perfectly, just the way you wanted them to come out. And it would be just absolutely right, with no seeming attention to it. It just was part of the way he did everything. And then he got a small job at something called the Washington Workshop and taught there, I think for the great sum of $5 a night. And they said he was a wonderful teacher, which I suspect he was. He was very articulate. He knew what he wanted to say, and he was able to say it.
Before I ever met him, my husband at that time, Ken, had told me about him and said that there's this wonderful guy, and he's teaching, and why don't you study with him? Well, I took him up on it, and at that time I didn't drive, so Sybil Myersberg would pick me up. Then we'd drive and pick up Morris and head down for the class.
He would have a stool that he'd set up in the middle or the front of the class, and with one leg on a rung, he would give us a brief history of abstraction and brought it alive to us. And then he came around to the present, and you might say that all hell broke loose. Because it was break all the rules, challenge the viewer, challenge yourself, don't be a slave to anything you've seen, just dig in and produce what's in you.
So often a teacher of art everybody's work will end up looking like the teachers. But this was wonderful because he encouraged people in their originality.
And those classes were very, very stimulating. And we all looked forward to it, and it wasn't a drag, and we weren't having to do plaster casts. We just did anything that came out. And lots of weird stuff came out, I'll tell you.
Unlike a lot of his Baltimore students, who I think possibly were already established as artists, these were mostly people that had other jobs where art was more or less a secondary thing.
Morris came over to Baltimore once every 2 weeks to teach a group of 10 artists, mostly women artists in the Baltimore area. And we brought work to each other's studios and unrolled it or unfurled it or dragged it in, because most of it was pretty large scale. Otherwise, we wouldn't have hired MorrisLouis to teach us, you see.
You know, when you paint you sort of fall in love with certain passages in your painting. There's certain things that you're really pleased with and that maybe look particularly harmonious, or maybe you think, oh, these colors are beautiful together. And Morris was, he'd say, got to get rid of that. Got to get rid of that. That's too pretty. And he was always right.
He purposely didn't discuss his own work. He avoided talking about it because he didn't want to be a direct influence on his students.
As a matter of fact, there was a question in our minds all the time, is what the heck do his paintings look like?
He encouraged us to always take risks, to paint the unknown rather than the known. You have many more failures working that way, but you also have more chances of discovering something that is new, at least for you.
And it was infectious. I mean, he was a very deeply serious person, and there was no small talk. It was really all about art.
His smiles were lovely when they came, but he wasn't a smiley type. We all thought he was great. It was one of the high points of my life, and we all look forward to them eagerly.
He would complain about the loss of time, but he was very good at it. He must have gotten some satisfaction from it. A teacher does if the students are responsive.
Alone in his studio, Louis continued to explore different styles to seek out his own voice.
He from time to time was obliged to go to New York to meet with somebody for some purpose. And finally he would reluctantly go, and he couldn't wait to get back home.
On one of those rare trips to New York, Louis met an art critic who would soon become a major influence in the New York art world.
I first met Morris on April 4th, 1953 at Helen Frankenthaler's studio.
I had made a painting called Mountains and Sea that was on unsized, unprimed cotton duck, and they were quite excited about it.
Her picture, he felt was the best picture he'd seen in New York, and then I do know he went home and changed his entire way of painting.
I think it just opened up possibilities for them. They saw this wonderful soaked-in canvas, and I think that that was what excited them. Not so much the painting itself, but that the fact that they could break loose.
And so here he was at 41, and he caught sight of the way he wanted to paint, his breakout, and as though you could say he was making up for lost time.
A paintmaker he met during the Depression would help make his goals materialize.
We had this little shop at 2 West 15th Street. It was about 1946 or 7 that Sam Gold and I developed an acrylic resin, which we, for commercial reasons, call Magna. Now, these Magna colors were the first synthetic paints put on the market. And Morris found a great kinship with these paints and began to develop his own personal style, his own personal idiom. And this was all done on raw duck with our Magna colors.
He saw these acrylic paints for what they in fact were. He saw potential in them that the paint manufacturer himself didn't know existed. And what Louis did with them staggered his imagination.
Dear Len, once again, would you and the fellows be good enough to send the small order of Magnicolors as follows: 3 green earth, 3 Venetian red.
The resin was almost like honey, thicker than honey. And you turned on, and 3 tubes or 9 tubes didn't mean anything. But I said, Morris, we ought to do this in gallons, and put it in a can. To make a gallon of paint was a nuisance. I can't begin to tell you. To dirty everything, and I would try to squeeze it in between times. Now, with the use of Magna, Morris began to blossom.
Magna paints offered him the material he needed, and Louis began to paint at an unprecedented rate. Within 6 years, he would buy more than 1,000 gallons of turpentine to thin Beaucourt's Magna paint. would have thousands of yards of cotton duck, 6 to 9 feet wide, delivered to his tiny dining room studio in Washington, D.C.
He painted 7 days a week. He got up early. He tended to complete a canvas the day he started it. Acrylics dry very quickly. And the studio that he worked in was actually a room that had been the dining room in the house. It was so small, the painting took up an entire wall. And there were the rows of turpentine cans, and everything was quite organized and clean and practically spotless. It was very interesting. Could have been a laboratory. When Morris would come out of the studio, the painting would be drying, the fan would be on, and he himself would be tired, obviously tired, but not smeared with paint. He never showed any signs of having been a painter, but the house was redolent of turpentine, so that the door would be closed. Then he would be quiet, sitting on the front steps or sitting on the back steps or maybe out in the garden. We had a small garden. He enjoyed gardening. Rarely did we go out. He really had very little interest in doing anything except working in the studio or thinking about what he was going to do the next day. We had some close friends, and they had faith in him. I believe very few people who knew him in our social circle understood what he was trying to do, but everybody responded to the strength of this man. And what he got from all of us was appreciation of his integrity and of the essence of him, albeit not in understanding the images that he was making or that he was trying to work on. Some people understood a little bit, some people not at all, but they responded to him as a person. Morris met Ken Noland at the Washington workshop. Ken was warm, outgoing, friendly, and immediately responded to Morris, and they became friends.
It was very much all about art, and they would come over to our apartment or we would go over to their house. It was always amazing to go to the Lewises because here was this very bourgeois suburban house, and here was Morris ensconced in this tiny room, 14 by 12 or something like that. I mean, it was very small. I think that Morris used the size of the room to his advantage. He was very controlled, yet he did these wonderful, free, wild things.
And Ken was the first really breath of life, I guess, in Washington, as far as Morris was concerned.
It seemed to be a lifeline for Morris because he really hadn't had any acceptance in Washington.
We didn't talk about Morris's lack of recognition. It hung over us like a cloud all the time. You wouldn't talk about it any more than you would talk about the air around you. It was there.
Marcella was nurturing him, and they had a comfortable, productive life. And she certainly wasn't on his back all the time because she had her own existence.
I was a teacher, and we were very lucky that I was, so that we had a nice, dependable, albeit small, income.
They lived a very ordered life, which I think was what they both wanted. And he was going to keep painting no matter what, and Marcella was behind him 100%, and he believed in himself, and if he had never gotten any recognition, he would have kept painting.
The fact is that it was Kenneth Noland who brought Clement Greenberg to see Morris's work. Clem's appreciation and recognition were of signal importance to him. And it was Clem Greenberg who then was able to finally persuade New York people to look at Morris Lewis's work, and it was Greenberg who persuaded the Coots Gallery to have Morris in one of their shows.
I was in process of choosing the emerging talent show for Coots, and I went down on the 5th of January, 1954, and went through his paintings in it.
I think there were about 9 artists. There were 3 of us from Washington. He chose Ken and Morris and myself.
I first saw about 20 pictures that I thought were too much influenced by Pollock. But he had 3 pictures there that I thought had departed from Pollock, and he was the only one in that show I finally chose who was represented by more than one picture.
I mean, in 1954, that was great.
Tremendous excitement, indeed, indeed. And at the same time, tremendous anxiety. Because here you finally are going to have a painting in a reputable gallery in New York City. And that was very, very scary stuff.
Louis had his first one-man show in 1957 at the Martha Jackson Gallery, but the paintings he selected received little acceptance.
The show he painted for the Jackson Gallery was so typically abstract expressionist and showed so much the artist at sea. And Morris took another look, and he was sure he'd made a mistake.
He edited his work very seriously. Often he would destroy 4 out of 5 paintings that he had made. He was very hard on himself.
I often think the difference between a great painter and just a good painter is the artist's willingness to edit, not to say, well, this painting is good enough for Oshkosh, or I'll just let this one go to that small show, as opposed to rigorously editing what goes out of the studio.
When I became advisor over at French, Morris had his first show there in the spring of 1959. And I chose the show down in Washington. And it was a tremendous show.
Greenberg was a man who was persuaded that he knew what was what. And happily, in this case, he decided Louis was what also. And Greenberg pushed people in New York to listen and to look.
My reaction to Morris Louis's painting was that there was a neat stylistic difference between what Morris was doing and just about anything else I had seen on the scene at that time. I had a one-man show of Morris Louis's in 1960. They were super paintings. Morris was very interested in selling his painting, and I was involved in selling it, and I was the only dealer buying his work. And the one thing that seemed clear to me the first time I saw the paintings, and that never faltered, was that they were very beautiful. Not knowing very well whether the fact that they were beautiful was enough to put them into that category of paintings that is finally world class. But it seemed to me that they were beautiful right from the start, and I didn't think that people would have any difficulty recognizing them as beautiful.
Finally, at Greenberg's second show at French & Company, his paintings began to attract critics, dealers, and buyers.
Bill Rubin brought Andre Emmerich up to French, I think, to look at Morris's pictures, and Andre decided to take him on, and Ken Nolan.
French & Company closed. And Bill Rubin spoke to me, would I be interested in representing some of the artists that suddenly no longer had a home with the closing of French & Company. And Nolan and Louis came to me.
Emmerich saw what he saw and what he liked. That, of course, was very pleasing to Morris. To have a 57th Street gallery is not a small thing.
And it's been one wonder after another ever since.
He was very quiet. And often when he would be sitting perfectly quietly, I would say, "What are you doing?" And he would say, "Thinking." That's exactly what he was doing. You know, acrylic dries fast, and you must pretty well know what you're trying to do. Anyway, I think he knew what he was trying to do.
I knew Louis really only a little bit. I knew the last 2 years of his life, and he was almost a recluse. So I went down to Washington a couple of times and spoke to him and picked pictures.
When Andre had the show, Morris said, were there young people there? Did young painters come to look? He never said, did he sell a painting? I'm sure he was interested. No fooling.
There were few sales, not just for Louis, but for most painters. Most important living artists who later on were seen as great painters lived off their wives. Wives were usually school teachers, like Marcella, like Annalie Newman, like Esther Gottlieb, like Sally Avery, and so forth and so on. It is the school teacher salaries that supported the entire school of New York, with very few exceptions. She made it possible.
Although Louis did find time to celebrate Marcella's achievements, his life was his painting.
He was absolutely committed, focused, and nothing else really was useful in his mind for him.
I felt that he was withdrawing more and more from the world. It seemed to me he lived more and more. He was just living for his painting.
He demanded of himself absolutely everything he had to give to the work.
One of the most vivid memories in terms of my relationship with Louis was the last time I saw him alive, which was in May '62. I flew down to Washington, and he had the narrow stripes. He showed me really only very few. By no means showed me everything. He brought them up, we unrolled them, and I was terribly excited. And I think he allowed me to take 7 or 8 rolled up with me under my arm. I was flying back to New York that night. Terribly excited.
The tragedy is, one of the real tragedies, that Louis did not live to see his success.
Dear Len, I expect to be in New York before my show at Emmerich's in October, so if you have any questions, hold them. I was rocked a month ago when I was rushed to a hospital for an operation for what proved to be cancer. I've been home a week or more now and will take treatments.
Louis did not get to New York. He died at home on September 7th, 1962, at the age of 49.
Had he lived just a very little bit longer, 2-3 years, he would have seen it to the full.
But he didn't ever really see success. No, when he died, my one concern was whether I'd have enough money to pay for the storage. Because I thought, yes, someday this will really be something. But I didn't expect to see it.
Artists' widows get a bad press sometimes. Marcella was an exemplary widow, and a very supportive widow for the cause of her late husband's art. At his death, he was hardly known. The great breakthrough came, ironically, just after his death, when the Guggenheim mounted the first great retrospective, and it became a widely applauded instant success. The big change since Louis's death in '62 and now is the increase in the size of the art world. There are many, many more museums. There are enormously many more collectors. They increase the number of art journals. In short, it has become a major field of interest on the part of far more people than one ever could have dreamt of in 1962. It was a short relationship because he died so soon. What became a very long relationship was my relationship with his art. Looking at the work in the estate and planning exhibitions of this aspect of Louis, of that aspect of Louis. And I therefore feel I know him very well.
Today, Louis's art is included in major museums around the world. There have been one-man shows from the USA to Italy, from France to Japan.
The first series for which he became well known were the veils. They were called veils because they are, in fact, like veils one over another. And if you look at the back of one of the veil paintings, you will see that different colors overlay each other. And when you look at the front, your eye subliminally is aware of one color after another laying on top of each other. And you see pale greens and oranges and yellows that are there.
Basically, the palette of the veils is, with a couple of exceptions, a 12-color palette. He fills in with a few other colors. There are about 50 or perhaps more pictures that are divided once down the center and another line about 2 feet to the right of center. I called those pictures triadic veils. What it comes from clearly is 2 vertical braces of the work stretcher that the canvas was resting across, and one assumes that this whole group was done on the same stretcher and probably at about the same time.
The veils are fascinating because of the layering. You know, keeping it clear and keeping the layers dense at the same time is very difficult technically to do. We talked endlessly about how we thought he made the pictures, and of course I bought Magna Paint because I wanted to explore that, and it was extremely difficult to use. I wasn't able to use it. It had a terrible odor. I bought the gallons, and I couldn't get it to flow quite the way he did. What Louis invented is, in my opinion, so specific and so profound and comes so much out of him that no one but he could achieve this, and I think that that speaks to the greatness of the paintings. No one could do Louis's paintings but Louis.
I mean, to have come to the invention of the veils seems utterly extraordinary. I mean, it's the depth of each of those is a kind of pictorial, expressive solution to the problem of making a major painting in our time. You're invited to contemplate the painting over time and to let your eye go into it and then be brought back to the surface, to go into it again and to move across it. It does seem fantastic.
I find that the experience of the greatest of the veils really isn't of essentially a different order to what one's experience of paintings like those beautiful, glowing, spiritual Rembrandts like. You know, it's the same tradition, really.
The veils are, of course, totally romantic. God in the landscape. They are abstract versions of those grand 19th century landscapes painters like Bierstadt went out west to paint. The florals remain among the most popular paintings he did. He did not paint that many. They were the most romantic of his paintings. They were called florals, not that they really looked like flowers, but that the sensation we have looking at flowers is similar to the sensation we have, or is evoked by the sensation of looking at the florals. We think they feel like flowers. Still later, he painted the unfurls, bands of cascading color or narrow ribbons of color, leaving the middle empty, but not really empty, but filled with tension.
My generation of painters, those around Clement Greenberg and Emmerich Gallery, were fascinated by the idea of the open space in the unfurls, which we thought represented the abyss. That was a kind of a thought. It was just so striking to leave the whole middle of the canvas raw like that.
To imagine what it must have been like producing at that rate, particularly the unfurls, where I think within a year and a half, 2 years, he made 120 pictures at least. I mean, it's an astonishing output. And yet somehow that kind of output seemed to be necessary to work with that sense of assuredness which is characteristic of the paintings. So far as I know, he never saw one of the unfurls stretched, you know, which I found amazing. But having created this remarkable new structure, he's self-confident enough to know that it's terrific without even having to go and look at what it is when it's finished.
If you look at an unfurl, in terms of the history of art, it's phenomenal. There's no one that has ever thought to paint anything like that before. It's a totally new picture. The center is completely empty, you know, very charged kind of emptiness, but it's empty nonetheless by traditional standards. And that was the area where you put the most important thing in almost all painting, or even Cubist painting or Surrealist painting. To empty the picture out in that respect. And then to take all these bright colors and put them in the picture at once, that was also a no-no, you know? You're not supposed to do that. And yet he turned everything upside down, put all these colors in the corner, emptied the picture out. The sheer will behind that to create something so original, so stunningly original. At the same time, he would renew himself, go off in a different direction to the stripes where the emphasis is quite, well, it's different. It's shifted, big shift of emphasis there.
They were the stripes. God almighty, they knocked me down. Because we make pull downs, you know, and when you pull down paint, as you get to the bottom, it gets thin. And here was the stripe, the same intensity from top to bottom. And I said, you know, hey, Morris, how the hell do you do that? You know, to get something from top to bottom with the same intensity. And he'd take a cigarette out and he'd smile.
The other impetus that Louis felt was the puritanical one, the wish to boil down everything to the minimalist possible. Narrow pillars, one after another, lining up like an organ fugue, one tone after another, becoming purer and simpler in form as he went along.
The first time I saw Morris Louis painting was at the Guggenheim in 1961 when I was in college. And what struck me the most about it was a sense of freedom, just the fact that it felt totally unfettered. There was an impact of freedom.
And one's sense of the simultaneity of all those stripes and one's actual experience of the painting is so strong and so powerful that it seems fantastic that, as he must have, it simply got made one piece at a time, and when it was right, produces that experience. But the sense that all of that stuff just must have been materialized there in a moment. I mean, you really feel you must have had some way of just, there it is, and the whole thing's there. And I mean, one way in which I think I see the stripes is the paint looks as good on the canvas as it could have looked in the can.
The stripe paintings tend to get underestimated, in my opinion. I think that the best of those really are tremendous and terrific paintings. One is presented with the sheer experience of colour as your eye reads across those pictures, and it's a pure experience of the emotive power of colour. You know, and the fact that the paintings are flat means that the space is somehow inaccessible to you, and yet at the same time you experience it. And it's a magical quality, isn't it, when you see this?
Well, finally you just saw a painting, it just knocked you over, and you really got to thinking about what you were looking at. And when you could actually get alone in front of a painting and it was a beautiful and replete painting, you thought to yourself, wow, this guy really did all this? It's just a miracle, it's amazing. They're so unique. They really are that rare and that unique.
Any painter, consciously, is uncompromising. The question is, are you really, really uncompromising down in your pre-conscious as well as in your consciousness? And Morris was uncompromising right all the way down.
There's no human touch. That's what's so fascinating about them. There's nothing that shows the person did this. And almost, you know, sometimes they look like rock formation, something like that, by God. It's a lesson to us all.
How someone can have first the foresight and the vision to do these expanded, magnified paintings and still have the physicality of space that constricts him is almost a contradiction. So the process is a contradiction, and what comes out of it is perfection.
It's a startling kind of original beauty. It's like nothing else. It seeps around you. It's just quite astonishing.
Louis is considered now one of the great masters of post-war American art, and a whole new generation looks at Louis with a new sense of discovery. Poussin, the great French 17th century painter, once said that the aim of all art is to delight. Louis delights.